sometimes struggle to get up in the morning or wind down for bed at night? I used to find it so difficult. I woke up with no sense of positivity and brightness. I was void of motivation and spirit. This changed completely when I started waking up with a Lumi body clock. These incredible devices mimic the light and colour of a real sunrise and sunset, transforming the experience of waking up and going to sleep completely. Rather than being suddenly woken up with an alarm clock, the Lumi body clock will wake you up gradually with a natural sunrise. The Lumi body clock has been shown to improve the quality of sleep and awakening and to boost mood and productivity in clinical trials. You can personalise your sunrise and sunset from 15 to 90 minutes with their clinically tested unique natural light and more than 20 sleep and wake sounds. We all deserve to sleep well and to wake up feeling fresh. So if you're finding this a challenge and you want to try a new approach, go to lumi.com.
My dad was a musician, jazz musician, really played saxophone. So there was always music in the house. I can remember being into an album of his. It was actually an album of Latin stuff, like sort of big band Latin stuff, which he gave me actually more recently. But I remember that playing it on this old gramophone thing that they had. But I think the first time that I heard a piece of music where the light sort of went on and I kind of thought, this is for me, is when I heard Please Please Me by the Beatles on the radio, So that would have been about 1962, I think, and I would have been 7, 8 years old. But I remember it as being like a moment of, this is what I want to be. It seems strange to sort of think, I now have a grandson who's 7 years old, But having said that, I can imagine a similar thing happened to him, actually. He's got the music going on as well, So, yeah.
Yeah, it's strange, obviously much discussed, but why do you think, because people not only love the Beatles music, but it seems like a lot of people who I talk to on this podcast, the Beatles have the effect of making you want to do the same thing as them. You want to be like them. You want to be in a band. You want to play music. Yeah. What do you think it was about them, especially at a young age?
Yeah, it's hard to say, isn't it? They were certainly by the time. So let's say I heard Please Please Me and it was like, wow, and then I would have seen them on the TV maybe over the next 12 months, probably that Royal Variety performance thing they did. And, I think it's when you saw them visually, you wanted to be them, But, I guess it's because it was the first thing, really. Like these days, it's quite hard to imagine how grey the world was that one lived in day to day. And suddenly the Beatles were in Technicolor somehow. Obviously they were in black and white on my parents' TV. But do you know what I'm saying? It's like the way the music sounded, the way the energy that they had, which I think a lot of it's in their vocals, in those McCartney, Lennon, the way they harmonised together. I think there's a particular energy in that sound that made them just compelling somehow at whatever age. And I think that's still what grabs people now, in a sense.
Yeah.
But I think
what you're saying about the energy just really resonated in the sense of, because they weren't just kind of cute little harmonies like sung softly or, not even meaning to be condescending. Like I love, for example, Simon and Garfunkel, where it's quite like quiet and restrained. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of the time they're going like quite loud and like projecting quite a lot on those harmonies. Like they're so confident in the notes and the way those voices.
Think a song like "Babies in Black," off of With the Beatles, their third album. That mid-late section. Oh, how long will it take till she mistakes she has made? The way that dovetails into the verse, but the harmonies where I think McCartney's voice stays on the same note. The other things, and it's not like they were singing, because some people sort of go like, the Beatles just like the Everly Brothers, but the Everly Brothers were singing everything in thirds, and the two melody lines, as it were, moved in parallel, whereas with the Beatles they were independent lines, and there's something really exciting about that and quite crunchy. There was dissonance as well as sweetness in the way they were singing, and I think that pulled in pulled you in, and especially if you're musical. Because I was thinking about this before speaking to you now about what got me into music, and I think it was this sort of the fact that there was dissonance in their music. It wasn't immediately easy to figure out what was going on when you were learning it. As I sort of wanted to learn guitar and stuff, so it sort of pushed me to a different sort of level, in a sense, rather than the slightly more predictable chord sequences of especially pop music at that time, the sort of the chart music of that time.
So you started learning guitar. When did you start making your own music? When did you start learning?
Yeah, I started learning when I was 8. So pretty, very much just wanting to, yeah, because again, I was thinking about, it wasn't just emulating the Beatles in a kind of like just standing in front of the mirror pretending I was them. Do you know what I mean? It was wanting to sort of take it apart and figure out what was going on, And I remember getting the sheet music to All My Loving, which is, again, as a song, it's quite complex to a degree, in the sense that it modulates within the verse. It changes key within the verse. And so, and I remember getting the sheet music for it and taking it along to my guitar lesson, and my guitar teacher sort of showing me some of the chords, and I sort of worked on it really hard, so that I could play it. And I remember then sort of getting to that point where it's like, okay, I'm going to play along with the record. And of course, the sheet music was in a completely different key from the record. And that was one of the first great realizations about music, that it's like, just when you think you've reached the top of that mountain, there's another even bigger mountain to climb. That whole process of getting the sheet music and learning the songs as well as listening to them was very important.
Why was the sheet music in a different key? And that's interesting that you learnt to sheet music. So you learnt playing the Beatles, with that kind of more formal way as well.
In a way it was, rather than just doing it by ear, because I think at that age I couldn't figure out how the chords were moving. Do you know what I mean? So the sheet music gave me a sort of map of what was going on. And when I say sheet music, it's just like the chord tablature and like the chord names and stuff. So why was it in a different key? I think maybe the record was very sped or something like that. I can't remember now whether it was like radically different. I seem to think that it was like kind of.
I think that's the case for a lot of sheet music, of popular stuff. And now there's the whole, for people listening, who are trying to learn music, there's the whole thing of the internet where, because obviously it's nice that people work out the chords to stuff and then put them online. But, I guess quite often, like maybe even as many as half of the times, the chords are wrong.
Yeah.
So like if you're picking up a guitar or playing a piano for the first time and you're like, I'm going to learn my favorite tunes, and you just think it's gospel what you're learning on the internet, you're like, why does it sound so bad? And it's often just wrong.
No, I mean, it's that whole thing with music notation and stuff is it's a complicated thing to get right. There's a good few years ago now, there was this beautiful book that came out, which was the Beatles songs in full score, so rather than just like a piano reduction and chord tabs and stuff, it's like if there's 2 guitars, 2 keyboards and stuff, it's all written out, transcribed by these Japanese guys, I think, and it's like really interesting to look at, because listening to music is one thing, but when you can see it on the page as well, and you can see like, oh, there's a voice there going like a little melody sort of thing, even if you can't read music that well, you still can get that extra information from the score, if you know what I mean. And but looking at that, there's huge amount of mistakes, in terms of what's going on, and that's a sort of very legit, highly regarded bit of score, so it's a complex thing to notate these things. And of course, the Beatles weren't working from notation; they were, doing it all by ear in the studio. Apart from when George Martin scored out strings or something like that. So
that's one of the interesting things about them that surprisingly few people know, is that none of them could read music.
Yeah.
And they were just doing everything by ear. How do you work now, and how have you worked through your career as you found success? Have you used sheet music much, or have you worked by ear?
In my entire, sorry, my chair is squeaking here. It's like, I don't know if you can hear that, but
I can't hear it.
No, in all my career in working in studios, and I never once saw a bit of sheet music floating around. And most rock musicians have no clue about notation and music, which is fine, I think, because it's like having taught music to a degree. Well, it was a degree that people were doing. There is this sort of sense that if you can read music, it gives you some sort of secret key that unlocks a whole load of secrets. It's not to say that it's no good. It's useful to be able to read music, but no more than that. Useful, I think. But the main thing is developing your ear. Being able to hear intervals and hear the way chords work and the density of chords and stuff. If you can then write it down, that's great. It's another level of analysis, if you like, but it's not super essential.
Yeah, I suppose for playing live, unless your style is more kind of formal, classical, whatever, and you've got like a bit of sheet music in front of you. But usually, when you go and see pop and rock concerts, people aren't playing to anything. No, and especially during the improvisational sections, you need to have it all in here, and
you do really.
A bag of tricks.
Yeah, where I have used music is since I've been doing some more jazz-oriented stuff, and I find that those musicians are all, well, actually really highly trained musicians, so they use sheet music and as a natural thing, and a lot of jazz tunes are freely available as sheet music stuff, So with that, when I did my jazz albums in the sort of 2000s through to until fairly recently, I was doing that stuff. I was tending to write parts for the musicians, so they had stuff to play from. But then, of course, those parts are a sort of springboard to improvisation. But that's where notation really did come in useful. Yeah,
jazz is jazz sort of the pinnacle of popular music playing wise?
Wrong notes, yeah. Jazz, it's complex, isn't it? When you jazz, it's like saying classical music. What would you really mean by classical music?
Yeah.
Vast array of stuff. So jazz for me is, you open that door with jazz written on it, and there's a whole load of stuff. A lot of it I really am not very interested in. But yeah, insofar as it affects a band, certain rock bands like Steely Dan, I suppose, spring to mind as the ones who were most clearly influenced by jazz techniques and thought in a sort of jazz kind of way, I think it can be a very healthy influence, and certainly, when I'm thinking back to the 70s, I was not particularly into bands that were heavily influenced by jazz. I quite was interested in the Mahavishnu Orchestra because I think John McLaughlin's guitar playing was very impressive. He's an incredible musician, I think, actually, in whatever he turns his hand to, But more latterly, when I've listened to musicians, the sort of Pat Metheny, Chick Corea, Keith Jarrett kind of jazz, for me, that has no appeal whatsoever, but slightly heavier, well, I suppose more experimental things, but when I say that, I'm talking about a musician like Brad Mehldau, who I don't know whether you know, he's a jazz pianist, famously has done covers of things like Radiohead's Paranoid Android. So the repertoire that he draws on is quite wide, do you know what I mean? And he's able, I think, to bring a sort of mixture of jazz and classical sensibilities to some very interesting music, So yeah.
It is a huge thing to just say jazz. There are all types of jazz, and the genre is particularly, it feels like in London at the moment, among session players, amongst kind of the community of musos, people who are really good at their instruments. I've come across in London, I've come across a lot, and everybody is really, really into jazz, and they listen to old stuff, like Miles Davis. They listen to Herbie Hancock. They listen to kind of like Chick Corea, who came on this podcast, and some classic stuff. And then also there's the sort of jazz, not exactly pop, but kind of more modern fusing of genres. People like Jordan Rakai. So there's this. I feel like people are really more interested among the kind of really passionate musical community in in, as you described, like dissonance, which you even talking about with regards to some of the Beatles parts, and interesting chords and things that challenge them musically. Which is quite strange because I mean I'm very vanilla in my tastes. So when did you first start getting into like more jazz orientated chords and like different stuff? I mean, it sounds like you were at the ear for a bit early with the dissonant Beatles harmony.
Well, the Beatles were a great training ground, really. You know, it's from being like 8 years old listening to Please Please Me and that sort of early sort of rock and roll influence stuff, you know, through when I was 12 they were doing Sergeant Pepper, you know, so that was I think Sergeant Pepper is, you know, shows a very different kind of approach to harmony, you know, and just musical texture as well, the way they orchestrated those songs and the whole way of approaching the recorded sound in the studio was incredible to get your head around, really, you know. And again, I think these days it's perhaps hard for someone like yourself, you know, to appreciate quite how like revolutionary, literally it sounded like music from another planet when I first heard Sergeant Pepper. You know, I'd never heard anything like it, you know, even being a Beatles fan sort of up to that point, you know. So there was that. But I think I then, you know, the legacy of Sergeant Pepper in a way was more in terms of prog, what we now call, you know, prog, progressive rock. So it would be bands like Yes and Genesis, King Crimson, I suppose Led Zeppelin as well. I think of them as a prog band, really, you know, rather than a metal band. I think that does them it sort of misses the point, really, about the kind of musical complexity that they were addressing and what they were doing and the way they mixed up genres. And a sort of, you know, John Bonham had a very jazzy kind of feel in his playing to my ear. Do you know what I mean? It's not that kind of crashing. I mean, he had a great, you know, like a big drum sound sort of thing, but he had a lot of funk in his playing, and that's what makes his playing so great, I think, you know. So again, you know, when we're talking about these genres, you know, I always sort of think it doesn't really cut it, you know, because it's really particular artists, you know. So when you talk about jazz, so like Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, Charlie Mingus, John Coltrane, you know, those musicians are, you file under jazz for sure, but each of them as an artist is very different, the kind of things that they're doing, you know, and each of them has an approach to dissonance and the kind of particular blend of influences that they're bringing to the table, you know, and each of them, you know, is, you know, any musician has time well spent in studying their work and trying to play those tunes and trying to approach them, you know. But I think that kind of jazz really didn't make any sense to me until much later in my career, like the 90s, really, when I'd stopped being the artist and had started being more of a producer. And I guess at that point in my life was sort of really casting around more for how I could get myself out of the corner that I painted myself into.
That's interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess for a lot of people with an ear that's more accustomed to pop chords and stuff, jazz just has no appeal. So I'm hoping I can become more sophisticated because, you know, I do appreciate jazz, but I don't think it's not as embedded as being brilliant, like just instantly.
I totally know what you're talking about. Like, I remember my producer with Everybody Have Fun Tonight, Peter Wolf, you know, he was in Frank Zappa's band and he knew all the jazz players in LA and stuff, you know. And I remember him talking to me about Miles Davis one time and I was like, don't really know his stuff. And he was like, oh, come on. And we went out for a drive in his car and he played me Nefertiti. And I was like, yeah, this is pretty good, you know, and I did like it. And I bought a copy of the album and I liked it, you know, but it wasn't until sort of 10, 15 years later that I became obsessed with it and it became really important to me and started to kind of push into my own creative process, you know.
Yeah. Oh, so there's hope maybe, because that's exactly the type of thing that happens to me now. It's like I like it, but it's not like when I put the Beatles on or one of my favorite, or just a great pop or rock record and it hits you in your soul. Does jazz do that to you now?
Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely. It's very kind of, you know, I listen to it because I love it. It becomes a sort of, I always remember I bought, like, probably when I was in my 20s, you know, got some Christmas money or something like that, and I bought a John Coltrane CD of like sort of best of, do you know what I mean? And I remember taking it back to the record shop. I just couldn't deal with the way that it sounded, you know. And yet I remember going through a phase where I had to play Coltrane every day because it became an addiction to hear that particular sound that he's got, which is so incisive and kind of abrasive, really. It's not a comfortable sound at all, but it's intensely powerful and expressive and questing musically, always sort of questing. You know, he was a musician who was never stood still and was constantly trying to sort of find new solutions to the problem of being a tenor sax player, you know. And that kind of mentality like really appealed to me, you know.
That's really interesting that, you know, at one stage you couldn't deal with it to the point that you had to return a CD. Then you got so addicted to it that you couldn't stop listening to it. And I know it's not quite what people mean when they say this, but like the expression, oh, people never change. Like I can think of so many examples in which people do radically change. I mean, I know that expression is more sort of directed towards people's kind of character, but I think even that can change as well. Like, I mean, people develop and evolve. And I guess, well, I'm getting sidetracked in telling your story because
no, it's all good what you're saying. You know, this idea that your neural plasticity, they call it, don't they? I think, you know, that your brain is sort of changing all the time. You know, and I think music is one of the great things, you know, to facilitate that in a way, because you never get to the end of it. You never get to a point where it's kind of like, okay, I've really, you know, sampled practically, you know, all there is to hear, and I know what I like and I know what I don't. You know, it just isn't like that. You're constantly evolving through different things, and at various times, different artists suddenly reach you in a way that they weren't able to, you know, because of where you are in your life, really.
Yeah, it's very true. Because, you know, a year before I became obsessed with Elton John, where I was more, you know, in love for the first time and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But that type of music obviously appealed to me. The year before that, I was obsessed with Metallica. So your life can change, and that can have an influence. So what I wanted to know, though, going back to when you're learning guitar, getting into the Beatles. When did it evolve to the point where you thought, or was there a turning point where you thought, I want to be involved in music professionally, I want to do this for my career, and you started taking that seriously?
I think from pretty early on, really, you know, that's how I saw myself, you know, as a sort of guitar player. You know, I sort of remember when I was like 15, I used to listen to Hendrix and think, I'm going to be that good in a year's time. Do you know what I mean? I'm going to be Jimmy, and it's going to be me, you know. Of course, you know, didn't quite work out that way, but I just saw that I wanted to be a musician, you know, not necessarily a rock musician, because in those days, again, I don't, or maybe it's because my world sort of that was the world for me. Do you know what I mean? So I didn't kind of see it as a bigger thing, you know. I think the broader horizons really came when I went to university and the Royal College of Music and started studying classical music. I think that's where the big change came in terms of seeing music as this sort of massive sort of universe, really, you know, and all of the different components that make it up, you know.
And how was it extremely difficult to get into the Royal College of Music?
It was difficult to get into university. You know, I went to a sort of regular state school and did A-level music, you know, and but I knew nothing about classical music. And I remember going to a couple of university interviews and them sort of interviewing me. So they would sort of say, so what, you know, what do you listen to? And I'd be like, you know, Yes, and Led Zeppelin, and, you know, stuff. And they'd be like, no, classical music. And I'd be like, well, I don't know, the stuff I did for A-level, like a bit of Elgar, and, you know, and they were kind of, well, you've got to know about the subject if you're going to study at a degree level. And I was thinking, like, well, I'll pick it up. It's all music, isn't it? You know, because in those days you couldn't study rock or jazz. I don't think there were even jazz courses in this country, certainly. And this was in the sort of mid-70s, you know. So, doing a music degree meant doing classical music, you know. And I think I just got into Goldsmiths because the guy who was the head of the department had written a piece with an electric guitar in it. And so after slightly despairing of the questions he was asking me and my lack of knowledge about anything, he rummaged around in his briefcase and said, would you be able to play this? And I was like, sure, you know, because I could sight read and stuff, you know. So I was playing his piece at a church in London where there was this big sort of avant-garde music concert. And So yeah, so that's how I got my place at Goldsmiths, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
And do you still, would you still be able to play like, classical pieces and?
Yeah, I'm probably fairly rusty, I would think, in terms of technique to be actually be able to play them, but I could sort of work my way through them, yeah.
And do you think that was kind of an essential part? Did that have an influence on what you have gone on to do since then?
Yeah, I think so, because it's sort of classical guitar. You're not learning chords, and so you're not thinking of music in these sort of blocks and sort of like in blocks. You're thinking of it as a linear, as sort of lines of music, if you like. So the music I used to really enjoy playing on classical guitar was Bach, J.S. Bach, which is all about counterpoint, which is quite hard to do on guitar, But I think that sort of made me think about harmony and chords and melodies as independent ingredients, and of course you hear that in, say, Brian Wilson's writing, in the Beach Boys, so a song like God Only Knows, for example, the way the melodies work, the way the bass line works, the way the independent counter melodies work, it has all that sort of freedom of expression, and you get it in Radiohead as well. They're very rarely do you have just a guitar strumming along, especially in their later work. It's nearly always linear constructions. So I think that classical thing just made me hear music in it makes you deconstruct it more and hear it as parts. And I think I tried to sort of do that, in Wang Chung, with the way we approach writing and stuff. So it doesn't always work, not always appropriate, but I was trying to get that level of dissonance up in Wang Chung all the time, and trying to sneak in these kind of dissonant chords,
Yeah.
I remember there's a double album by The Cream called Wheels of Fire. I don't know if you know that album. And a track on it called As You Said, which is got some very kind of dissonant chords on it. It's a totally brilliant track with sort of acoustic guitar, cello, and Ginger Baker's just playing a hi-hat along with it, And the way the chords work in that were a massive inspiration for me, And I was always trying to get that kind of, it's basically using diminished fifths in the chords, rather than natural fifths, and trying to get that kind of quite edgy sound out of the harmony.
Yeah. I mean, you can, now that you're talking about it, you can see all of this stuff in Wang Chung's music. But it's done in a way that's not kind of immediately like, it's not like it doesn't feel like it's unnatural in there. They feel like, I mean, the records are huge sounding for a start, some of them. And it doesn't sound like pop, because pop and a lot of stuff, for example, that I quite like by The Weeknd, for example, now, it feels like those records they do well in the charts now, haven't kind of progressed in any way in terms of how big they sound, in terms of, it feels like the 80s was, in my mind, the last great era where pop music sounded new. So how did Wang Chung form? Because it's quite an interesting story.
So essentially, I left the Royal College, by which time I was sick to death of classical music, really, and the whole approach of how that all worked, And punk was coming up in London, this would be 1977, So, and that was really thrilling. I remember hearing the Sex Pistols, but particularly hearing Talking Heads and Television and some of the American bands, who were technically really more art rock bands than punk, but everything in those days was sold as punk, But certainly these bands were sort of experimenting, and everything was quite gritty and stripped down, and that had a huge appeal for me at that time. And I did a few auditions basically to find a band in London that I could play with. And through one of these auditions in the Melody Maker, I met Nick Feldman, who at that time had this band called The Intellectuals, and he was looking for a guitar player, So I auditioned for that and got the job. And, I guess in those days there was a sort of gigging circuit in London. There were probably, 7 or 8 pubs in the sort of like just kind of, not exactly central London, but, like out towards Barnes and Chiswick and those kind of sort of satellite little towns, that what used to be satellite towns in London, And there were pubs there where record company guys would go and drink and check out new bands and stuff. And we were on that circuit for a good few years with different incarnations of what we were trying to do, you know. And and finally with Wang Chung, we sort of got signed actually through making some demos, which a friend of ours had a studio, and we just kind of made this a song called "Isn't It About Time We Were on TV?" And with I guess in all the sort of creative industries, the idea that you sort of work really hard and you're really good at what you do, and then you get successful is not how it works. You know, everything turns on a sixpence really, and it's all to do with, you know, you try this, you try that, you try that. Meanwhile, somebody's heard something else and has another suggestion, and something happens over here, so you move off in that direction. And the least expected things are the things that turn out to be sometimes the most fruitful, you know.
That's I think that's a very accurate way of looking at life in general. It seems to me. At one stage,
you're busy making other plans, I think is the
exactly. That is the most apt lyric. And sorry, I was too busy talking over you for anyone who have heard that. So that was life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans, right?
Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. John Lennon song.
And from Beautiful Boy on the Double Fantasy album, a very very apt line. At one stage, when you were called Wang Chung, right, you formed under pseudonyms, and your pseudonym was based on something by Zola, Émile Zola, right?
Jacques Hues, which is a French I accuse you, basically. So it was Émile Zola had written this book accusing the French government of hypocrisy over a thing called the Dreyfus Affair, which was to do with anti-Semitism back in Paris in the 19th century. But I think Graham Greene, the novelist, wrote a pamphlet called Jacques Hues about some kind of sort of mafia type thing that he was, you know, it's to do with the idea of sort of justice in a sense, do you know what I mean? And pointing out hypocrisy and stuff, you know. And I remember a friend of mine was basically saying when all the musicians in London had changed their names, you know, like Joe Strummer and Johnny Rotten and stuff, you know, this friend of mine was saying it would be really funny to have someone called Jack Hughes, you know. And I thought,
I think
maybe I could be him.
Well, it's worked very well, and it is very, very funny and witty, but you know, a moron like me didn't get it until some more further research, and then it really cracked me up. But it also made me think, God, how unsophisticated am I? Because I would never think of something to base something on the French literature.
Well, you know, the great thing about rock music is everything's possible, you know, and I think what I love actually, and I sort of revel in it a lot in my more recent sort of solo work actually, is the layers. Basically, you can go down through the layers. You know, you hear the surface layer of kind of like, oh, I really like this tune or whatever it is, the beat, or you know, but then you start listening to the lyrics and you start listening to how it's connected up and you know what it's referring to and some of the references that I give on the albums and stuff, and maybe you start reading about Ted Hughes or whatever it might be, you know, and you start to get into these other layers, and that for me was always the thing with rock albums, that there was either a historical aspect to them, you know, so like the Cream, you know, there were tracks by people like Muddy Waters, and you know, and you start thinking, well, who's Muddy Waters, or I was anyway, you know, and you go back and then Robert Johnson and stuff, and you start listening to these older things, you know, and then other times, you know, with Beatles tracks, there'd be more literary references and stuff. You know, John Lennon sometimes, you know, he published books and stuff. And then, of course, with Bob Dylan, you know, there's a whole literary kind of layer to that as well, you know. So it's like, you know, if you don't have that curiosity, it's fine. You know, you get the music on a certain level, you know, but if you do have the curiosity, then you start going down the levels and it starts to become really three-dimensional, you know.
And that is so true. Do you think that the way that we're consuming music now, the way that music is being presented, is making that very difficult, or not something that would occur to anyone to do, to spend the sufficient time with the music to get really into those little parts. Oh, I love that bass line, or the lyrics, or the layers. You know, spending time with liner notes, appreciating all the little things. I mean, if you listen to an album now, how would you even know that a track was by Muddy Waters?
Yeah,
it wouldn't be on the vinyl sleeve. It wouldn't be on the CD cover. You wouldn't know.
Sure. Yeah.
So what effect is that going to have?
Very true. Yeah. I mean, I think it does sort of flatten music out somehow. This ease of access and making it easy for the consumer, if you like, to access whatever music. Yeah, it's a different sort of thing to what I grew up with. I sometimes feel quite negative about it, but friends of mine who are younger, are kind of like, well, it means actually that you've got a lot more, rather than having this, what you're sold by the record companies, you can go off on searches yourself and find all kinds of highly individualized stuff that you like and nobody else has ever heard of, sort of thing, So it's much more, you can be much more personalized in a sense. But I sort of agree, that the whole experience when I grew up buying records, when they were, vinyl albums, and they were relatively expensive, so you could buy one every 6-8 weeks or something, So when you bought that thing, you listened to it over and over and over again, and you've sat and looked at the artwork and read all the liner notes, and, it was a much more sort of immersive experience in a sense, But I think, like as you're saying, you go through phases of, you'll listen to Elton John, and I'm sure you would listen, in depth to his albums, and in particular songs would really sort of get you, So if you're musical, then you have that whole thing happening, I think,
Yeah, it doesn't. It's not the be all and end all. It's not like it's banned to get into artists, and you still have devout fan bases. So they slightly changed it for some people, and perhaps it's meant that these big superstars come around a little bit less often, but maybe not even that. It's difficult to know what the effect of all of this is ultimately going to be. But do you listen? Because I see lots of CDs there. So do you still listen? Do you listen to music on CD? Do you listen to records, or do you stream?
Everything, really. I sort of was quite resistant to streaming, but I'd say in the last 2-3 years, I really got into it. I think the last 2-3 years, for various reasons, I spent much more time living on my own and stuff, so I've had a lot more time, and I think streaming at that point, especially with classical music, actually has been amazing, because the thing with classical music is there's a relatively small number of sort of core works, if you like, and so it becomes much more about particular performances, and there are recorded performances of, say, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, going back to the 1920s, through to the current day, and each of them has something to offer, and so with streaming services, you can sort of audition these different recordings and stuff, and that becomes something just quite amazing in itself, but to get to what you were saying, is really, I found myself buying CDs more recently, actually, and a friend of mine was emailing and saying, there's these articles saying, CDs are coming back, what a lot of crap, basically, and CDs are awful, they don't sound good, and and I thought, well, that's not really true, they sound pretty good, they're not as good as kind of like Blu-ray sort of high res stuff, or even vinyl sometimes, depending on who's mastered it. But they're great I love these sort of box sets, where you get like the more recent Beatles releases, the Let It Be thing, where it's like 6 CDs. I did buy the vinyl as well, but the vinyl's quite cumbersome to handle, do you know what I mean? And there's something very convenient about the CD format, and it certainly sounds good enough, to be listening to studio chatter from the Let It Be sessions, So, some of the Bob Dylan bootleg sets are just fantastic, sort of, multiple takes of one track, and there's that set that's devoted to 1965, I think, where there's a whole CD of them trying to record like a Rolling Stone, and it's just fascinating to hear them kind of in the studio, sort of, just doing different takes. It starts out as a sort of slightly jazz waltz type thing, and then they get it more into shape, and then they play it pretty well, I think, after about 10, 15 minutes. And then the next 45 minutes they spend not being able to play it at all. And that's sort of that process in the studio I find just really fascinating. I think in 100 years' time, if anybody's really listening to rock music, those sort of documents of the creative process in the studio will become as important as the scores are to like Mozart symphonies and stuff. They give you access to the process.
Oh yeah, we don't know how this is all going to be regarded, but
absolutely.
I mean, I don't know what it was like I can't fathom a world without it, but when it turns into history, as it's almost getting to that point, it's going to be strange to see how we interpret it. And I agree with you. I think those things are going to be taken like pretty seriously by some people.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
But the idea of them struggling to do it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of my favorite CDs is Thelonious Monk playing. There's a tune of his called Round Midnight, which is a very famous jazz standard, that he wrote when he was probably like 18 or 19 or something. It's like incredibly precocious bit of music, and he must have recorded it a few times and certainly played it dozens and dozens of times, and on this recording he's in a studio, I think in Paris or something, and it's like half an hour of him not being able to remember how to play it, or rather he can't remember how to play it. And it's like ogling really, but it's to do with that, that whole sense of really creative people. They're not machines who just switch on and churn it out the same each time. Each time it's different. Each time the creative process takes them in a different direction. And you get that with Dylan. If you go and hear him live more recently, the way the songs sound is completely different from how they sound 60s records, which some people find very frustrating. And
some of them are unrecognizable. I find it all very funny though. Like that's kind of his thing, is that he's an eccentric person, it seems. And I mean, I think that is one of the most exciting things about pop music, and particularly about live music. And all creativity though, it's the creative people are human. They can make mistakes. And the idea that we're all packed in this big arena or little theatre or wherever, and these legendary people are coming on stage, and they could make a mistake. They could slip up on the stage. They could fall over. Anything could happen. I mean, there's that footage of Dylan telling people to put their cameras away, and then he like collapses, trips over like a wire or something. And people are
those experiences. Yes.
And therefore it's remarkable that people attain legendary status and have big hit records in the first place. So what I wanted to know was what was the thing that gave Wang Chung the initial success, do you think? Because obviously you had different kind of names and different periods just getting going before getting signed, and then suddenly big records started coming out like Don't Let Go and Dance All Days. So what do you think it was that propelled you into kind of that level of success?
I think it was the songs, Dance All Days in particular. I felt when I sort of wrote it, I remember playing it to Nick and him being like, this is really good, and we did a demo of it and played it to our manager and played it to the record company, and you could see immediately people were like, at last they've done something that's pretty good, and I think it was I wasn't conscious at the time that I was trying to write a hit record, and I don't think Dance All Days, when you listen to it, you don't think, oh, this is a very contrived song. I think it's got a sort of freshness to it, so but that I think with all bands really, that you've got to have a hit record. I've known a number of bands that I've worked with or been friends with and stuff, and they can be really great live bands, great in all sorts of ways, but you have to have that song that connects with a sort of mass audience, and if you don't get that, it's it's just more tough, really,
I mean, that's not only a hit record, though. That is a song. That is one of the best, in my opinion, one of the best records. Not pulling your leg of the 80s, and it is one of the great pop songs. It's a song like literally comes on within 3 seconds, and you're like, that is a good record. And then you listen to the chorus, and then you're like, that is a bloody good song. And it never gets old. I mean, do you feel that way about it, or are you sick to death?
I do really, yeah. I still enjoy playing it. You know, we play it live and stuff. You know, and yeah, it's sort of I don't know what it is about it, but it's something about it that sits very comfortably with my voice and with the way that I play and stuff. You know, that kind of shuffle 12/8 sort of rhythm thing that it's got. You know, yeah, it's those songs come on.
A lot that goes into it, yeah. Particularly the shuffle. It is a weird. Can't even imagine like trying to play that on drums.
It was weird at the time because we were recording with drum machines in the sort of early days of drum machines. You know, the drum machines are very good at going, dum, 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 but trying to get them to go, it's much more time consuming. And
yeah,
Chris Hues, the producer on that album, we spent a lot of time trying to get his lead drum to kind of do that stuff. It took ages to program it, you know, but yeah, it's kind of good.
Do you have well, yeah, more than kind of good, but do you have good memories of touring the US around that time, and presumably just life changing hugely?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't tour a huge amount. I mean, we did a big tour in '84, I think, on the back of Dancehall Days. We were supporting the Cars. Yeah, that I sort of it's a bit blurry, you know, but it was an incredible experience, you know, playing these big stadiums. Basically, we were the opening act. They were incredibly successful at that time. So we were 70, 80,000 people. And because Dancehall Days was a proper hit and a sort of MTV hit and everything, there were a lot of people in those rooms to see us, you know. And yeah, I probably didn't really appreciate how time it was at the time, you know, because it all just comes, you know, from playing some little, you know, the Marquee in Wardour Street in London, you know, to playing, you know, Meadowlands in New York City. You know, it's like it all happened within a year, basically. Wow. You know? So, but yeah, no, it was an incredible time, and we toured again in '87, I think it was '87, yeah, with Tina Turner, and she had her sort of big hit records at that time. And again, it was a very big tour, and yeah, again, I think, you know, back in those days, the technology, because we were trying to replicate the records, because in those days the albums were seen as, when you made a recording, you were making a sort of definitive statement about the song, and each performance was an attempt to kind of replicate that, you know. Whereas now it's more like the recordings are just a snapshot of a song, and each performance it's sort of reborn, which I think is a healthier attitude in many ways. But with trying to get the technology, you know, using sequencers and programmed drums and stuff on stage was much more precarious in those days than it is now, you know. So and everything was a little stilted and kind of trying to get the machines to work with what you were doing, you know. So I always felt that we were a little constricted by that somehow. And these days, you know, playing, you know, like when I do my solo stuff, it's a completely live band, and we do the songs in such a way that there's improvisation within them and stuff. It's much looser, and that appeals to me much more temperamentally than sort of
recreate
playing the stuff. Yeah, you know, when we do the Wang Chung gigs, we use a sort of backing track component and stuff, which ties us to certain tempos and stuff. And I sort of struggle with that a bit. You know, it's okay, but I would rather be sort of playing the whole thing live. But in order to do that, you'd have to have a much bigger band than we tour with, you know, and then you get into the problems of, you know, the making it economically viable to tour and stuff, you know. So
yeah, really, really difficult with how big the records are.
Yeah.
Would you is Mosaic your favorite album? Like, obviously, you know, it's probably your most commercially successful, biggest. I don't know really.
No, actually, I think when I listen, not that I do listen back to them particularly, but I think when I've sort of reapproached them, To Live and Die in LA is the one I feel probably stands up most to sort of, to me, it doesn't sound too locked in its time period,
Not at all. That
yeah.
sounds like it could have been released like this week.
Yeah, it is very fresh, that record, and that's an album that we did very quickly. We recorded most of it in a week, apart from the title track, which we did later. So that was a very kind of incredibly exciting time, actually. That I remember as being when we were top of our game. No, we were sort of very. I think it was an inspired and inspiring time to be working.
And well, I'm conscious that you've got a call coming up, so I need to wrap up with,
sure.
with a final question, which is, you're an incredibly inspiring figure. I feel like I barely, hit the tip of the iceberg with my question.
A lot of ground, so it's like
there's a lot of ground to cover. So what I wanted to finish off by asking is, you're still, firing on all cylinders. Very busy working with Wang Chung, working on your solo stuff. What would you say is the number one piece of advice that you've got to people who want to be sitting in your position at your age and still feeling inspired and motivated to work as hard as you do?
Yeah, well, I guess it's a slightly boring answer in a way, which is, learn your instrument, and I think, you never really get to the end of learning an instrument like guitar or piano or even voice, and so that gives you the sort of the fire, as it were, to want to keep going, and then be curious about music. It's such a vast area of human endeavor, and and just because you took a John Coltrane CD back yesterday doesn't mean in 10 years' time you might not be sort of like not being able to get enough Coltrane, So I think keep curious, learn your instrument and keep curious. I think that's the thing.
I think that's really excellent advice, and not that easy to follow. So I hope many people, myself included, will follow that advice. Thanks so much, Jack, for taking
That's a pleasure, Tom. Yeah.